Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Ben, it's a pleasure to have you on the show, man. Would you like to introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
Sure. Thanks. First of all, thanks for having me. Really happy to be here. My name is Benjamin Cunningham, Ben Cunningham. I'm worked as a journalist for a long time. I've been based in Europe for about 15 years. Um, Worked a good part of that time as a correspondent for The Economist, writing about Central and Eastern Europe. A couple of years ago, I relocated here to Spain. I'm based near Barcelona, but I have a book out called The Liar, which I think we'll hopefully get into today talking about. So about a former Czechoslovak spy during the Cold War. And, that sort of brought together some personal interests that I had for a long time, history and politics and things like that. And it was a story I sort of stumbled upon when I was a journalist based in Prague for a long time. So happy to get into that and whatever else is going on. I'm originally from outside of Detroit, Novi, Michigan. So hi to the people of Michigan. I hope you're not too cold today.
Can you tell me a little bit about how you got interested into learning about the Cold War in general?
Yeah, I think, so I was born in 1980. So I was, 1989 when sort of the Berlin Wall came down. I was 9 years old, sort of, pretty young, but sort of first sort of getting conscious of the world a little bit or interested in stuff. I remember, and actually I put this in the acknowledgments of the book, my parents at some point, I wanted to do a book report on, I don't know, Michael Jordan or something like that. And they kind of pushed me towards, doing something about the collapse of the Berlin Wall in whatever, fourth grade or something like that. So probably there was some kind of seed planted there just because I just sort of stumbled into, history was happening and sort of was paying attention to it at the same time. And then I guess the other part of it is just kind of the silly stuff that usually gets everyone interested in, James Bond movies and then as I got older, a little bit more, sophisticated, even in the fictional spy world, John le Carre, these sort of things that you kind of in the old movies of the 50s, 60s, 70s. And I was history in general. I studied, I went to Miami of Ohio for my bachelor's degree, studied history, ended up sort of drifting towards European history, moved to Europe, in particular during my time in Prague. That's sort of a prominent theme of even the contemporary politics there. So it was a sort of like a slow burn developing expertise. I don't ever remember making this decision that this is a topic that I'm I wouldn't say it's a topic I'm dedicating my life to now either, but it was never like, I love the Cold War, I'm going to chase after this single-mindedly. It just sort of things kept going that way. And that's what I ended up being interested in. And I kind of found myself in these positions a little bit accidentally, but probably subconsciously, put myself in these positions where I was sort of learning stuff and, kind of wading deeper and deeper into the field. And so hasn't, so it's just kind of continued now. I'm in my early now, so we're talking about 30 plus years of kind of wading through all the gray areas of the Cold War.
Yeah, when you dive into the Cold War subject, people always go, "Oh yeah, it was like nuclear destruction was going to happen at any moment." It's like these types of talks that get talked about. Go, well, a war was happening. It was just fought with the intelligence communities. It was people stealing information. It was an information war, and I think the public hearing that kind of sparks up an interest. But whenever I look at like a Cold War subject, I go, "Oh, this person knows about the intelligence communities." Now there are some that I know extremely a lot about, the FBI, CIA in particular. But then there's like the KGB. Then there's the other certain intelligence organizations, British intelligence, other things that start going on. You start going, okay, so there's a lot of stuff out there that's going on, but the issue starts to become, what about the documentation? You're asking for intelligence documentation about these types of things, and that's not an easy get. That's not like filing a Freedom of Information Act, and you're like, oh yeah, we worked with Walt Disney at one point. Like that's really common example for like an FBI thing. But then if you're trying to dive into like what secret tactics were going on to either against communism or maybe from the communist side, what types of tactics, what types of operations, what type of knowledge or transfer of information was going on. And then when I came across your book, The Liar, about Karl, I was like, I have never even heard of this guy. So I'm curious how you even got interested in kind of finding Karl's name in the first spot. And if you could tell me a little bit about his story as well, too.
Sure. I mean, maybe just to introduce him, and then I can get into I mean, you're right about the documents and the these sort of inner workings of these intelligence agencies. So Karl is he was born in Bratislava in the 30s, 1934. Um, Moved to Prague as a youth, and basically grew up sort of, so that's prior to World War II. So lived through Nazi occupation, communist takeover of Czechoslovakia. It was still, of course, one country, Czechoslovakia then. Now it's the Czech Republic and Slovakia. And in the mid, sort of was a rebel as a kid, as a teenager and stuff like that. And sort of actually was getting in trouble with authorities. Was, in the 50s in particular, early 60s were hard line times in the communist world. And he was not a guy that kind of followed rules. So he kind of was, yeah, literally getting in trouble with the law, and that was sort of sidetracking his career prospects and that sort of stuff as a young guy. And he was an ambitious, smart young guy. And basically, by the early 60s, he kind of, it clicks in his head. He's like, if you can't beat him, join him, kind of thing. And so he sort of hatches this idea of himself that, maybe I could be, he spoke a bunch of languages. Maybe I could get involved. If I get involved with espionage myself, maybe they'll send me abroad. Maybe that would be cool. He's kind of, maybe I get out of here and I can do something. So he joined so the Czechoslovak spy agency was called the STB. So like the KGB, but the STB. He became an STB agent. And in 1965, Karl then and his wife Hana, the STB sent them to the United States, posing as basically dissidents, refugees that were fleeing communism, to be sleeper agents. And his job was to penetrate the US government, the CIA. And so he moved there in 65 and eventually succeeded, and we can get maybe to the latter part of this later, in 1973, actually getting a job, passed a lie detector test, got himself hired, and worked for the CIA. And so then was a double agent working inside the CIA, sending information back to the STB and then the KGB in Moscow. And so for me, I got interested in this story of Karl and Hana, who that's his wife, who was sort of an accomplice more than a spy herself, was sort of like, when I was living in Prague as a journalist, it was sort of like an urban legend, urban myth. People kind of knew the rough sketches of it. It wasn't a total secret. And I found him and started meeting with him. Is where it began. I kind of had been a journalist in Prague long enough that I kind of, a couple of degrees of separation, I was able to connect with him, and I would go to his house and start doing interviews. But back to the document thing you mentioned, a lot of, not the KGB, so not Russia, but a lot of the countries that were communist that are now democratic, after the collapse of the communist regimes, they basically opened their spy archives to the public. There's some bits that are still classified, but for the most part, it's public domain. And so it clicked in my head that I could, if I could get get a hold of all his files and stuff like that, they should be accessible, and they were. So there was tens of thousands it was 20 something thousand pages that I went through of his files. So there's files of him when he was a kid, when basically the secret police were monitoring him as a troublemaker and teenager, kind of a hellraiser. And then there's also files of him, reporting on his mission, and, sort of like almost like human resources type documents, assessing his performance and things like that. And so, they were all in Czech. My Czech is getting worse, but I spoke decent Czech. My wife is was born in Czechoslovakia. She's Slovak. So, I was good enough to go through the documents and kind of find the substantive ones. She kind of then helped me with, real detailed language stuff. I had a couple other students that helped me with, perfecting translations when I'm quoting from the documents and things like that. But I was really fortunate in that I had sort of like a starting point, two sources. Him, not that trustworthy a source, because he's kind of gonna have his own take on his own life, obviously. But then the documents from the STB archives, and those were pretty damn useful because the interesting thing is that you can, whatever you want to say about intelligence agencies or communist intelligence agencies, a bureaucrat filling out a report in 1977, he's not writing that report with, in anticipation that, 40 years later, some journalist from the United States is going to be going through that. So there's some, they're not entirely reliable, but you're able to sort of like, gauge their reliability, what they would lie about or something like that. So, and those documents are really the backbone of the book that I wrote, because I was able to like assemble sort of a pretty clear timeline. You were able to sort of piece together like actual sort of episodes and encounters that were surveilled really in a really detailed way. And as you say, you kind of get this, when you put some pieces together, you get this sort of real-time picture of sort of how an agency like this kind of functions. And that was really the between the being able to kind of penetrate the personality of a guy like this. I'm like, who is a guy like this that would engage in this sort of crazy, risky behavior, being a sleeper agent in the United States for what amounted to 20 years, lying about his identity for 20 consecutive years every day to his friends and his neighbors. And then two, you get this sort of continuous snapshot of the inner workings of like an intelligence agency in the Cold War. And so that those two things together, I was sort of like, this story is too good not to do something about, too good not to explore.
I think when you look at like the intelligence agencies from all around the world, I like to consider them like you get to know them like a date. You start putting together their personality, like, yeah, she's loyal, but she's just so bossy. And it's just like that's what kind of these agencies are in a sense. And I'm gonna ask you about his childhood documents first. I just need to know what they were looking for about his profile that stuck out as someone that would be a good agent of a sort. Because when I talked to Vern Lyon, who I told you off air, what worked for the CIA, I mean, he was going for an aerospace engineering degree. He wasn't like, super into like the politics. He wasn't into any of that type of stuff. But the way that they got him was at an airport nearby. I think it was I'm not going to say, I don't think it's Michigan. I think that's because you told me that's where you live, and I just somehow stuck in my head. But there's St. Louis or something, there was an airport bombing, and the CIA, whoever, went exactly to his car, put him under arrest, then went back to his place, and he was building little model rockets for his aerospace engineering projects and things for his college course, and they used little tiny sticks of dynamite, and then he was getting the blame of this blowing up at this airport. And I mean, you can go look at his law profile. He was in jail for 47 years without an explanation, but the only charge was that airport thing, where it was like, it doesn't take 47 years to find the guy or do any of this type of stuff. But the way that they had him was getting leverage over him. And I go, so what about you that stuck out to the CIA? And they were like, honestly, the only factor is that I would be the person that would listen and just disconnect from my family, my friends, and everything like that. I was like, but did you have like a hard childhood? Did you have anything that was like these flags that they could use? And that's why I'm interested in finding out more about this documentation on this kid. I mean, someone that's doesn't listen to authority, or it might be like a bomb and like the situation. It doesn't seem like it would be an objective goal for an intelligence agency, because you want someone following your exact orders and making sure that we get the secrecy on lock. But it's perfect if you're sending them over to another country and you're really going at this idea of like rebellion type thing.
Yeah, I think so. There's a couple, a couple things. One, so he's a kid and he's kind of anti-authoritarian, kind of rebel type of guy. He actually is implicated in, as a teenager, some sort of which was probably a domestic STB sort of sting operation. some sort of attempt to acquire, he gets involved with a bunch of other teenagers, and there's one or two other older characters. They're actually trying to acquire rifles because they believe they're going to overthrow the communist regime, literally. So it's like this half-baked, childhood kind of thing, but also like potentially serious. They didn't take that sort of thing lightly, but somehow he kind of slides through. I guess it was just such an incompetent, operator. So he's sort of on their radar because of these sort of like, half-baked, crazy sort of schemes that he's kind of not direct. He's not the ringleader, but sort of like,
we call them innovators.
yeah. So that's one element of it, and that's actually why he's then sort of hassled as he sort of gets into college and tries to get into the workforce, because he's kind of got these black marks on his record. The other thing that he has going for him, though, he speaks a lot of languages, first of all. So he spoke English, he spoke German, Russian, Czech, Slovak, right? That's a highly useful French. So that's an insane skill set for international espionage. He was studying sciences, physics. So he had a physics degree. And he also then was studying 2 degrees at the same time. Physics at Charles University, which is the most prestigious university in today's Czech Republic and then Czechoslovakia. And then he was studying at like a film school. So he's pursuing two bachelor's degrees at the same time. So he was just an ambitious, capable guy. Now you sort of put those two things together, and you have a guy that has at least the skills, the potential to be a great, intelligence operative, but he's not that trustworthy. And I think, this is, now I'm sort of, saying what I pieced together in my head. My sense is that the STB sent him over to the US as a sleeper agent. They didn't think he was going to succeed. They didn't really care, right? He was also kind of like a guy that was better off to have abroad than at home, because he was kind of ambitious and not trustworthy and highly skilled. He might make, he could just as easily be a guy that's going to make trouble for the communist government because he kind of doesn't follow rules. So they said, what the hell? Let's send him over there and see if he comes up with something. And if he gets caught, who cares? And if he comes up with something, great. I mean, I think in the end, that's kind of what happens. If he gets caught, we'll just deny it, and we'll lose a guy that we don't care about. So there's a bit of a and then this is something you kind of, when you go through these documents, these are STB documents, so I can only make this allegation fully credible, when talking about the STB. There are quite a lot of decisions that amount to just being like, what the hell, let's do it, So there's some method, and then ultimately it does, should we send him, should we not? And they send him. There's sort of all these things about his background that they're like, well, this isn't good, this isn't good, this isn't good. And then in the end, they say, well, why, what do we have to lose? What do we have to lose is maybe this guy gets arrested and goes to jail, or he's executed as a spy in the US or whatever. And what do we care?
Do you think it was a message, though? Like, because it's really interesting if you study the history of propaganda, like a lot of this created paranoia, and kind of like that's how they do it. It would be like mental warfare against your enemy. And I think if like, hey, if he brings back documents, that's good for us. But if he gets caught, then they're going to be like, okay, we got spies in our midst, and it's going to create just more paranoia to start searching through.
I think that's true. I think that's even like second level thinking that it didn't even get to, that it's like, this is going to create some more atmosphere. I think it's even simpler. It's like, maybe he'll get some documents, maybe he'll just make some chaos and get caught. Chaos is better than nothing. And so, what do we have to lose? And I think it's a cost benefit analysis. There's no cost. The cost is we send him, he gets caught. We're not losing some guy that we value that highly, and we'll just deny it. Right? It's that crazy. What do you mean? We didn't send him. He was a troublemaker here. You guys can keep him. You know what I mean? That kind of stuff. So I think, you're right. It's just sort of like this throw him into the mix, and worst case scenario. You're right. What's even the bad outcome doesn't have that bad an outcome, because it is like, maybe he'll get in there and make some chaos for a while and get caught, and then that's better than nothing. And maybe we'll get lucky. And they kind of got lucky. Maybe we'll get lucky and he'll actually make it to the CIA. And then, the STB was subservient to the KGB to a great degree, and so then maybe we can show the KGB that we put a guy in the CIA, and maybe then they'll, I'll get promoted. So it's all these sort of, yeah, it's all of this, but a lot of these, I mean, I think you've hit on a good sort of topic too, like, and this is something that also comes across as you kind of just go through these documents, is how human this all is, right? Some guy sends them, orders them over there, and that guy's motive to send him over there is like, well, what do I have to lose? And if he succeeds, maybe I'll get promoted, right? Maybe I'll, and then there's also all these times where they're sort of analyzing his performance, and people are really reluctant to actually say, you're reading these reports about, oh, he did this, but he did that, and the conclusion of the report is like, I'm not going to make a judgment on whether he's good or bad, and that's because that person doesn't know in 2 years, if he does something stupid, am I going to get blamed because I said he was a good agent, or if he does something horrible, and like people are all sort of covering their ass in terms of throwing him out there into the wilderness, for lack of a better term, but also like making sure that they have a buffer, from taking blame if it goes horribly wrong. And that stuff is really, really clear for 20 consecutive years of tens of thousands of documents. Those are threads that run through it, and that's one of these things that you sort of you draw this conclusion about how effective any intelligence agency, or you raise a question and I draw a conclusion that just the human element of an intelligence agency is, and combined with what an intelligence agency thinks it's doing, is so flawed that even in the best of circumstances, the results are less than ideal, to say the least, and in the worst of circumstances, like total disaster. So it's a real, when you kind of go through the inner workings of all this stuff, you're just like, this is how the world functions? Like, what the hell are we doing? Kind of thing.
Is there a quick response between those documents, like from the documents from when he first started sending messages back to the replies that he was getting? I mean, was there a reasonable amount of time that went by before they were responding back to him? Was it very, very quick? I mean, I'd have to think if you're sending letters or getting postcards to another country, that's going to be a couple red flags on, our intelligence agency over here in the States, radar. I mean, but the tactics, they're like, we got to get to the polygraph test too, because I got to know when that polygraph test was.
So I think so two things. I mean, so they did do stuff with postcards and stuff like that, but they had like coded language. So they would do stuff like, it's been I wrote the book about a year and a half. The book came out in August, but I wrote it well before that. It took a while to go through the process. So some of these details are not totally precise, but stuff like if you use an English word in your postcard to your mother, that means everything's okay. If you use 2 English words, it's like I went to the store yesterday. You're writing that in Czech, and then you're like, and the baker said, "Have a nice day," and that would like signal, okay, we need to set a meeting, right? And then the meeting would be for 2 weeks after the post date on the letter, right? So there was all these sort of things that would be pretty difficult to and most of the communication came in face-to-face meetings. So they would pass, and then with people that were pretending to be diplomats at the United Nations in New York. So Czech diplomats that were actually STB agents that were sort of engaged in sort of dropping documents and things like that. The polygraph happened in I guess it was late 72. So he gets the job starting in 73. I think he was going through the interview process in the latter half of 72. And he actually gets a job. How he even gets there is pretty interesting. To that point is pretty interesting. So he poses himself as this dissident. He actually then studies, and this is talks about, points to his intelligence. He gets a PhD at Columbia. So he's studying philosophy at Columbia, and then while at Columbia, he's working simultaneously in a think tank that's based out of Columbia, run by Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was became the national security advisor for Jimmy Carter years later. So they knew each other. I mean, he was like a subordinate to Brzezinski was running a think tank within Columbia University that Karel worked at, and his had expertise on was producing reports about Eastern Europe. So he also then works for he works as a translator initially for Radio Free Europe, which still exists today. It's actually based in Prague today. Until I want to say the early 70s or late 60s, Radio Free Europe was directly run by the CIA. So now it's sort of spun off as its own organization. It's a U.S. government controlled entity, but not directly affiliated with the intelligence agencies. So he was sort of in a precursor, that's sort of like a precursor zone where it's like, oh, he's worked at Radio Free Europe for a couple of years. Maybe this guy is reliable. So the CIA was recruiting people from Ivy League institutions. He had all these language things. He had sort of styled himself as a real dissident. I mean, when he came to the States, his whole persona was fervent anti-communist, which people liked that as well. And so the short version is he finishes up at Columbia. He's kind of teaching a little bit here and there, being sort of starting an academic career, but he's a bit older. He's in his mid-30s. And he applies for a job simply. And then he goes through the screening process and he passes. And the final sort of step is a lie detector test. Two branches of how, how did he pass that lie detector test? The answer is there's two sort of elements to that. One is he was trained to. There was a Czech psychologist who was sort of one of the Eastern Bloc's leading, figures in sort of training you how to beat a lie detector test. I talk about that a bit in the book. What the technique is based on. The other element is that and this is kind of taking two steps back. So in 1968, the Warsaw Pact, so not just the Soviet Union, but led by the Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia was invaded by, Czechoslovakia was communist, but was reforming itself to be somewhat more liberal. That's the Prague Spring, and the Soviet Union and Poland and East Germany or whatever straight up invaded the country and overthrew the government and put in a more hard replaced the sort of reformist communists with more hardline communists again. And at that time, Karel's been in the States for about 3 years, and he legitimately has like a crisis, personal crisis where he's sort of like, who am I working for? What am I? I thought we were on the same team, and now you're invading my country, Czechoslovakia. Like I'm Czech, and you're sort of nobody likes to be invaded by their neighbors. So he actually in 1968 goes to the FBI and kind of tries to turn himself in. There's a report on this too. So he goes to the FBI and he's reluctant to straight up walk in there and say, hey, guess what? I'm a foreign agent that's trying to infiltrate the US government. But he goes in there and he kind of says something like, there's some Czech diplomat who's sort of talking to me all the time. I think he might be a spy. He's trying to get the FBI to take an interest in him, and he's seriously considering defecting, basically, eventually, if he can make some sort of deal to just turn himself in or work with the FBI in arresting other spies. The FBI doesn't really pick up the hint, so he and I think there's a quote in the book that he says, he's like, at that time the FBI is trying to investigate the mafia. They're not interested in the FBI is not really sophisticated enough to be fully engaged in sort of counterintelligence work. So they kind of don't do anything about it. And so then he's kind of drifting for a while. And then, okay, fast forward back to 72 when he's trying to get this job at the CIA. One of the questions on the lie detector test is something to the effect of, have you ever been in touch with a foreign intelligence agency? And he says yes, which is true because he's a foreign intelligence agent. But they also have the FBI reports of when he went to turn himself in 1968 and self-reported having been in touch with what he suspected to be a Czechoslovak intelligence agent. So in other words, the fact that he self-reported himself then allows him to say yes to that question honestly, and the people administering the lie detector test determined that's what he's referring to, not that he himself is a foreign intelligence agency, if that makes sense. Was that clear?
It's clear. I want to raise another. I want to raise another probably third option for you as well too. Now, is the lie detector test? We're talking about a polygraph test, right?
Yes, correct.
Okay. So there's a around this is only because I know this from the Kennedy assassination. There's a call between J. Edgar Hoover and Lyndon Johnson, and it's on one of the tapes that you can find. I've played it on air before, but it's when Jack Ruby's requesting to get a polygraph test where he says the truth will come out. And Lyndon Johnson says, "What do you think about this?" And Hoover says, "I don't trust those polygraphs a damn bit. They're not functional. They don't work properly." And I go, he's saying that in 64. And I go, it wasn't exposed until 2013 or 2014 by the Innocence Project that those polygraph tests were bullshit. So you can't use those in court anymore. And it was like, how many people were wrongfully convicted? And I feel like if you're an intelligence agency, you hook someone up to a polygraph test, whether you I don't know, you want to believe that they're innocent or not, you're kind of just going, look, if he speaks multiple languages, if he's been, talking about, or he might be an immigrant or something like that, you're already kind of suspecting him of communism. You could just fail the test for him and say he's obviously a traitor, but we're going to bring him onto our side and have him set up thinking that he either passed or failed these polygraph tests. And I'm not saying that's what happened. I'm just saying that's another option that's out there too, is that a lot of the tactics that they use were kind of meant to influence the truth a little bit and get their main narrative across. At least in our intelligence agencies, it was very, very manipulative. And a lot of the public, I mean, everyone believed that the lie detector tests were 100% foolproof. But when I heard J. Edgar Hoover, the leader of the FBI, say that, and I go, yo, he knows this shit like 40, 50 years before it was exposed. And I go, how many times could someone have been just like manipulating evidence in that sense? But I don't know. I mean, your explanations as well too, they're very, very in depth and descriptive. So I mean, those make sense to me as much as anything. I mean, that's to me, I just go, we don't know what the intelligence agencies, what the hell was going on. And I mean, the FBI going after the mob, I mean, that was Robert Kennedy's whole giant thing, was going after the mob. I think Hoover never even officially even acknowledged them, and that was because
Yep.
they had photos of him in a dress. Now I have the photos, I can show you those, but I
Is that
can't
I'd like to see
verify
those.
those are
All
it's
right.
he's a very pretty woman, I'll tell you that.
No, I think you're right. I think that the thing with the lie detector test is right. Beating a lie detector test doesn't test whether you're telling the truth. It tests whether you can beat a lie detector. Right? It's like the SAT. Does the SAT measure your intelligence? No, it measures how good you can take the SAT.
I hope it doesn't measure my intelligence.
Exactly. So yeah, no, I think it's and so yeah, I'm with you. I'm with you. And I just to add to another point. So what the CIA at the time, contemporaneous to Karl's time, was willing to do to get people with, for example, language skills. And so this is just a minor. It's in the book. So there was a group of Russian they were called the Vlasovci. That's the Czech word for it. It was led by this guy Vlasov, General Vlasov. They actually, during the beginning of World War II, joined the Nazis. They were old Russian elites that hated the communists because their land and stuff had been taken away. They'd been on the other side of the Russian Civil War, in the 19 teens, and they had lost. So when World War II when Germany and the Soviet Union turned on one another in World War II, he created a unit that then went with the Nazi, joined the Nazi side and started fighting the Soviets. And then when the tables turn the Soviets then start pushing into Central and Eastern Europe in the latter stages of World War II. Vlasov's gang is fleeing, and they're fleeing west to try and surrender to American soldiers rather than the Red Army, because they're afraid of what the Red Army is going to do to them, because they are Russians that have been fighting for the Nazis. So they fail. The Nazis the Soviets capture this unit. Vlasov is executed. but there are a group of people that do not die, or sort of, the unit sort of comes apart and they manage to escape, and the CIA hired them. So these were Russian elites from the early 20th century, so fluent Russian speakers with knowledge of, who had grown up in Russia, who had friends and contacts still on the ground, that fought for the Nazis in World War II, but hated communists, and therefore were pretty useful to this, language skills and local knowledge useful to the CIA, and severely anti-communist, which the CIA was willing to. If you're anti-communist and spoke Russian, whatever you did in the past was sort of, you're willing to overlook that. And so then Karel, when he's actually working at the CIA, he's in a unit that's sort of monitoring Soviet communication, wiretaps of Soviet embassies and such. And some of the people he has to work with are Russians that fought for the Nazis that are now working for the CIA, right? And so that's, you're correct in this sort of, when they're interviewing people and when they're, recruiting, when the CIA is looking to recruit people in the 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s, they're willing to make some pretty, moral compromise, rely on some pretty morally compromised people, because they have skills, they have language skills, they have useful skills, and they're willing to overlook these guys were fighting for the Nazis, which is deplorable,
Well, we did that with what is it, Warner von Braun, who created our whole space
Hey,
program. I mean,
exactly, same idea.
He used to hang the 5 slowest Jews at his rocket facility, and we were just like, "Hey, do you mind building us a fucking rocket?" And I'm like, "Dude, what are we talking about?" There's a picture of him with his hands behind his head and his feet up on a desk or whatever. Like, you're like, this guy is a horrible human being, but you would not be able to tell by the picture. He just looks like an average dude who's, happy about his life, maybe just got a promotion. Reminds me of Homer Simpson in the commercials or in the Simpsons episodes when he's working at that nuclear facility. He's just put his feet up on the desk for like the danger button.
With donut.
With Karel though, was this normal with immigration from the Czechoslovakia? Like, was there a lot of people that were heavy immigrants that had, because I mean, I would have to think that, it probably wasn't super weird that a lot of these people spoke double languages, but there's just certain people where they start kind of noticing about your profile. If you're very anti-communist or you have these roots of anti-communism, then you're probably someone that they already don't have to work about trying to break you down to get to that point. They can just use you already, or pick the people that were heavy anti-communist.
So Karel as a kid spoke English really young, and so even starting in the 50s, he actually worked. So we're talking about as a child. So in Czechoslovakia in the 50s, let's say, and in Europe today, people generally speak multiple languages or have some understanding of multiple language, right? But your second language in Czechoslovakia in the 50s was less likely to be English. It'd be German, it'd be Russian, right? It would be maybe Hungarian, somewhere in the neighboring countries or whatever. So English wasn't, and certainly, the formal education system was not in the practice of promoting English, because that was, the enemy's language or whatever. Karel's dad had a bunch of English language books when he was growing up at home, and he was a smart guy, and his dad spoke English and stuff like that. So he kind of developed English on his own at a very young age. So as a teenager, he's actually working as a tour guide in Prague for tourists who speak English, right? So these are sort of, there aren't that many of these people. He's a young guy. And so he is a tour guide around, Old Town Prague. The center of Prague is really beautiful. One of the guys he gives a tour to is a professor who is affiliated with U.S. military intelligence. This is sort of comes out after the fact, but he's a professor at Bryn Mawr. It's in Philadelphia. He specializes in Central and Eastern European, literature or something like that. And these are some of the first Westerners during this sort of really tense Cold War that are sort of going on exchanges with, to the Eastern Bloc. And he's studying things that are not, don't appear to be political. And Karel is his tour guide. And then the guy comes back in, 3 years for another sort of academic exchange. And Karel meets up with him again. And all told, he has 3 or 4 encounters with this guy. And so when he is tasked with moving to the States, he contacts this guy in the U.S. and he basically tries to use him to help kind of pave the way for him. So the guy does, one assumes the guy also kind of vouched for him in the sort of government system, because Karel and Hana, again Hana being Karel's wife, they get a visa quite quickly. They flee Czechoslovakia to Vienna, to Austria, and they get a visa to travel to the States pretty promptly, as refugees, kind of suspiciously fast. So there's some indication that there was, the wheels were greased in some way for him in that case. But the guy also definitely sort of formally helps him get into academia. He gets him a fellowship at Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana. That's kind of, I think, Karel's second year. They spend an academic year in Bloomington, Indiana. And then this guy also sort of, clears the path for him to get into Columbia to do his PhD. So there's some, and Karel openly, kind of talks about how by the time, not on the first time he gave this guy a tour did he assume him to be affiliated with American intelligence, although it was suspicious. Any American who was going to be in Czechoslovakia in the 50s is suspicious. By the time he's, developed this sort of spy sense and he's sort of looking for ways to make things happen, he knowingly sort of manipulates this guy to kind of open a few doors, even if only to open doors to so he can get a job when he gets there and stuff like that. So there's some
Did the guy have a military background in petroleum geology? That's the real question, because that was a cover for so much of sending some type of agent to another country. Because what you just explained about this military guy is the same thing people point the blame at George de Mohrenschildt about, because George de Mohrenschildt's background is very, I wouldn't say deep statey, but it's very intelligence kind of based. It's a lot of he was friends with White Russians. He was friends with there's a bunch of things that just did not fit his profile. But George de Mohrenschildt had this giant black book with he knew some of the top government officials. He knew presidents, but he also was very, very poor and had this kind of low level background. But they called him a petroleum geologist, where they sent him to other countries. And a lot of these countries where you go, here's the coincidental part where it's there's only so many coincidences. Every country he was sent to go look for petroleum happened to be one that the FBI was heavily influencing at the time. I mean, Latin American countries, in particular Nicaragua, all these types of things with resistance. And that's why I'm curious if there was a petroleum idea that was tossed out there.
So no, so this guy was in literature, but this actually makes sense too in the context of Czechoslovakia. So when communism collapsed in 1989, sort of the face of the democratic regime. I mean, the first post-communist president and sort of the face of dissidents from the mid-70s, certainly from I'd say late 60s until 1989, was this guy Václav Havel, who was a playwright. So the underground sort of democratic movement in Czechoslovakia the whole time was sort of among literary dissidents, and they ultimately were the people that took over the country in 1989. This guy became the president of Czechoslovakia. So as a literary professor, basically it appears they were sending him there to be pretending to be doing, hey, let's learn about poetry and playwriting or whatever. And in the meantime, he was going to be encountering these people that they knew to be, sort of the political underground simultaneously. So it's a pretty interesting, the same as it's a similar idea, but a different. There are no major mineral reserves in Czechoslovakia, so you had to kind of go a different way. But the way they went was sort of, they found a wedge that they could exploit. And Karel says that within his first meeting, or maybe it was the second time he came, the guy showed up with a list of, and Prague's a pretty small place. In the end, it's it's like 1 million people, but it's you can find people pretty easily as well. So Karel, the guy showed up with kind of a list of writers he wanted to meet under the guise of them being sort of interesting poets or whatever. And they were the guys that were kind of political rabble rousers.
Damn,
And
they got us
so
through our love of Robert Frost and fucking Shakespeare. I can't believe that. That's
that's right.
crazy. Oh, dude, I'm telling you, man, like when you like, for example, like I mentioned Vern earlier, what was interesting about him when we talk about like backgrounds on profiles of people was he said that the CIA, he let them know, he goes, I don't speak any other languages. You're about to send me to Cuba and I don't speak Spanish or anything. He goes, exactly. They'll never suspect that you're a double agent because you don't speak any language. They go, the America would not be that stupid. And I'm just like, wow, the intelligence community, I'm like, that's a really smart strategy, but that's risking a lot. But I think it's much like with Carl, like they didn't care if he got caught. They did not. I mean, he worked for Castro doing some stupid, like small little thing where it was just trying to make it rain. He was trying to work on bringing rain to Cuba. And he had a whole team of scientists and everything like that as well too. And he explains a little bit more in depth. But I go, they killed his whole team though. Like all the people that he worked with after he had to escape and he ended up getting stuck in like Canada. He got stuck in a bunch of different things. I mean, you have to listen to his episode to hear about it, but I mean, when you hear about like they did not care for your safety at all. And then when he got arrested and spent 47 years in prison, they did not bother to contact him and get him relieved of anything. I mean, it was a long process. And I go, I mean, when you understand that about your intelligence communities, you kind of just look at them like, what did they really, when they look at you, it's like, what did they have to gain? I mean, they don't have anything to lose if you get caught because you're already in an intelligence war. It's just about who's going to be the one that's going to be the one that launches the nukes first. So it's like we might as well just have fun stealing intelligence.
Yeah. So I think this is an interesting, I mean, there's also one distinction that you kind of come across when I was so right there. Most intelligence agents, right, are posed as embassy officials, right? That's a pretty, and so embassy officials have diplomatic immunity. So people get caught being a spy and they just get sent home, right? When you're talking about someone like Karl, I don't know as much about the case you're talking about. I'll definitely check out that episode. Um, Karl is sent as a sleeper. So Karl has no diplomatic immunity, right? So you get caught, you get prison or execution, right? And so this is so the other the sort of the surface layer of spies. It's like you're the cultural attaché at the embassy, right? And then it's like we suspect you of espionage. Then it's like you're deported. You have diplomatic immunity. You're not, that's the rule, and that's everyone accepts that as the rule. The United States is putting somebody in the embassy in Moscow who's a spy, and the Soviet Union is putting somebody in the U.S. embassy in Washington who's a spy, and that's sort of like official, chessboard kind of stuff. And when you get caught, you just trade them back. You send them back, and if they catch one of your guys, they send them back. When you get to this level of you're sending people in, with no diplomatic cover, that's like, I mean, and that's an interesting psychological difference when you're thinking about how somebody functions as a spy, you kind of think about, because that's like, if I mess up, I might be executed, right? Versus if I mess up, I'll get deported, then I'll have to probably just have a desk job because I can't be a spy abroad anymore. I'll work like those are different, and so you need different people, right, to do that job. And that's where, when we get back to the beginning, when you're trying to think about why do you choose this guy to do, because he's a little, I mean, the fact that Karl and it sounds like your guy are a little bit crazy, right? They're just like, they have irrational self-confidence. And so therefore, they're the worst person for this job and also the best person for this job, right? They're unpredictable. They could make a disastrous mistake because they're sort of, so confident in themselves and so sort of adventurous and sort of risk averse, or the opposite of risk averse, risk willing to take risks. They don't sense risk, but that's exactly who no sane person really chooses to take on an insane mission. You know what I mean? So you kind of need this. And so in the end, when you send people on a crazy mission, like trying to make rain for Fidel Castro, or trying to, penetrate the CIA, just move to the US and get a job at the CIA, it takes a weird, personality, and it requires you to that's a risky mission. So you need a person that doesn't really care about taking risks, or is so, megalomaniacal that they believe they can do anything, kind of thing. And that, that also then, you are willing to, for lack of a better word, throw those people to the wolves if you have to, right? You get caught by Castro, the president doesn't stand up and say, "Oh yeah, we sent that guy there, Castro." It's like, we don't know who that guy is, right? I have no idea who he is. He's in Leavenworth. I don't know who he is, right?
Plausible
Some guy's in
deniability.
Leavenworth. Fine, he's some guy. Yeah, exactly.
When it comes to Carl, though, when the U.S., I mean, when he was eventually, working for the U.S., I mean, when did they send him over? When they sent him over, I mean, did they? The issue with that starts to become like, I mean, you have leverage because his wife is still back in the United States, so it's like he's got to somehow return back home and see his wife, right? And so I'm thinking like, I mean,
He's
what,
not.
what?
He's not. He's not. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead. You're good.
Yeah, so I think that they didn't send him anywhere. So he was working for the CIA in the United States for the most part. He would go to Europe, sometimes on a trip. Sometimes he would go, under the auspices of meeting his friends and family in Czechoslovakia, which seemed, not insane, like was reasonable. You would want to see your mom and dad or whatever. They would go on vacation in Europe sometimes, and then they would be on vacation, and his bosses at the STB would meet him in Vienna or in they used to go on vacation in Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia is an interesting case because it's communist, but it's not affiliated with the Soviet Union. And so it's sort of like this gray area where everyone sort of, can meet. It's both, it is neither allied with the United States nor the Soviet Union, even though it's a communist government. So he and his I would add just to his wife Hana is also traveling. His wife Hana is a diamond dealer. She gets a job as a diamond dealer in New York City. She's working in the diamond district in New York, and she is flying around the world and buying. She's going to Israel and buying diamonds. She's going to India and buying diamonds. She's stopping in Switzerland and selling diamonds. She has a real job actually doing that. So that's another time where she's in Geneva making some sort of diamond deal, and somebody from this STB shows up and passes a message to her to pass to Karl. So his job for the CIA is mostly listening to wiretaps. So the CIA has tapped embassies mostly in all over the world, but Soviet embassies in he's focused on Latin America. So Latin American Soviet embassies have wiretaps in them, some of them, most of them. Soviet ambassadors' residences in Latin America have wiretaps in them. And Karl's job is to listen to the wiretaps and the phone conversations and stuff like that, flag the ones that are interesting, translate them. And his goal is to look for Soviet diplomats, officials, or whatever in Latin America that are likely candidates to be flipped to work for the CIA. And so the CIA has him listening to Soviet embassies to try and find somebody in the Soviet embassy they can recruit. And what he then is actually doing for the other side is also telling the communist intelligence agencies which guys the CIA is trying to recruit, right? So that's he's both telling the CIA which guy is a candidate for recruitment, and then he's telling the KGB the CIA might try and recruit this guy. And so you're right, he ends up having this life he has friends, he has an apartment, they own an apartment on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. They get used to living in the United States, which is certainly in the 70s and 80s a more pleasant place to live than on the whole than Czechoslovakia. They get this sort of taste for luxury that just does not exist in Czechoslovakia at all at the time. And so he does become anchored to the US and almost sort of bizarrely sympathetic. His wife's, their lifestyle is attractive. You're a diamond dealer in Manhattan. That's cooler than being some, whatever the hell you would be in 1983 in Czechoslovakia. So in some sense, it's not so much leverage, but it's, that anyone has over him, but it's sort of like, he's juggling all these things at the same time, sort of reporting on both sides, going now at the same time, all the while knowing this all could come to an end at any time, right? Sort of hedging his bets that maybe I'm going to need to tell the US that I'm a spy if that's in my interest, and it's going to, in interest of self-preservation, and maybe I'm going to need to flee on a moment's notice and end up back in Czechoslovakia. So I need those guys to be on my side too. So it's a real sort of I guess that's the thing that one of the things that intrigued me about it is this psychological sort of pressure that he doesn't he doesn't he doesn't have the luxury of really trusting anybody. So he is out for it in the end, mostly for himself to survive. But that's the kind of conditions that both those intelligence agencies sort of that's the working conditions he was under, right? He didn't have no one was going to help him in some way, so he kind of had to be entirely selfish in some way.
I wonder if the intelligence community ever picked up on some of those psychological conditions that were going on. Because you have to think, if you're coming to a new country as a spy, you have no invested value into this place that you're going to be living for an extended period of time. You have no life built up. You have no cars. You have no whatever. You're kind of just like, I don't care if I betray this country or not because I have nothing here. All my life is back home where I want to get back to eventually. Then, depending on how long you're in the new country doing your mission for, you end up getting comfortable. You end up building them, I guess, a life there. And the next thing you know, you're going, shit, I am now invested into my life here and I don't want to lose what I have. And that's like a weird thing, even with just an example of like Oswald's profile a little bit. I mean, he was part of a false defector program. And there's obviously controversies on whether, you know, that he enjoyed his life in Russia. I mean, we have a document that states he tried to kill himself in Russia and just by slicing his wrist, even though in his autopsy they never even
I should
talked
just
about
say
the wrist thing.
I've been to his apartment. He had an apartment. It's in Belarus now, Minsk, Belarus. I've seen his apartment there. Anyway, continue.
I'm jealous
It's
of
just in
that,
a regular
100%.
building, but it's pretty interesting. Anyway, so yeah.
I'm jealous of that. But even in his autopsy report, like there's statements from Marina Oswald and his brother that talked about they never saw cuts on his wrists. I've seen the autopsy reports. They checked his wrists deeply. They checked to go, we didn't really see any scarring. There was minimal scars there. So you have to think Russia's medical system is probably a lot better than the States. So if he would have even done some small damage to his wrist, they could have kept him in the hospital for an extended period of time. The one thing that was interesting is they never mentioned the gunshot wound that he got in the line of duty. And I go, well, that would leave scarring if it was only a couple years before, if he had got a gunshot wound or an injury from battle or anything. They didn't write that down in the autopsy report. But the interesting thing about the false defector program was they really kind of started to look at this angle from the US documents, and we learned more from the Russian documents. They go, he ended up becoming a real defector and he really did not want his US citizenship and all this. Well, Russia, I mean, the way that American documents had led on for so long was that he was really adjusting to this being a communist now. Well, the Russian documents even state nobody believed him to be a real defector in the first place because his Russian speaking was so bad. He seemed like a double agent all along. Nobody trusted him. And that's why you now have this suspectability later through like the recent release of documents, which is when Oswald came back to America with his wife and his baby, that he was going to be this, that his wife was a KGB agent. And she did have some weird connections in the background. And even, I think, she used Oswald as a thing to get to the United States because that relationship was just so dysfunctional. And it was like, man, it was like trying to really understand more about what the hell was going on is so damn difficult because you really have to base a lot of this on like, what was the time period like? What was the psychological conditions that people were going through as an agent? And how many documents do we not have either because they're destroyed or because they were spoken and they didn't write it down? It was over a phone call. It was over whatever. I mean, the issue with wiretaps is one thing, but it lends in a lot of light onto the exact situation that was going on as well too. And you kind of have to understand the national security issue, but also how, I don't know, things were described back then. I mean, even with Carl's instance, before he ends up getting arrested, I mean, what got him to that point? What got the agencies to start realizing that he was more of a threat than an asset?
So two things, and let me just say one thing about your larger point first. That so right, so the U.S. State Department, when they send diplomats abroad, they send them on 3-year tours. You know, so if I'm going to work if I'm a State Department official and I get sent, let's say Prague, I'm talking about now, they send me to Prague and I work there for 3 years. Then they pull me out and they make me come back to the States for 2 years, and then I go back out again to work at another embassy for 3 years, and then I come back for two. And so the psychology that you're talking about is like that is built into the systems of it, right? The idea is that you want to prevent, okay, a State Department official at an embassy's job is to represent the interests of the United States. And the longer they would be in a foreign country, this is not about spying at all. It's just about psychology. The more sympathetic they're going to become to that society, the less likely they are to carry out American policy if it's, distasteful and things like that. I mean, they call it going native, right? You don't want them to go native. You don't want them to all of a sudden feel as much Czech as they would American, right? And so that's built, that's a recognized phenomenon, and that's why the U.S. State Department actually structures. I mean, in theory, the longer someone would be in one location, the more expertise they would develop about that location. In theory, the better they would be at the job. But the State Department judges the risk of someone becoming more sympathetic with that foreign country to be greater than the benefit of somebody developing an expertise for 6, 8, 10 years about that country. That's one point. So back to Karel though. So Karel is, he faces this crisis point in 1976, and this is a really pivotal part of the book. I don't want to give away everything because maybe people will read it, hopefully. But there's a KGB leader, so a Russian, who I'm going to say I think was actually a double agent also working for the CIA. And for a variety of reasons, he Karel goes back to Czechoslovakia to face sort of like an interrogation, basically like check in with the supervisors. This KGB guy shows up under suspicious circumstances and interrogates him for days. And this, I would say, I have both written transcripts and audio recordings of the interrogation. So a good chunk of it's in the book, real-time dialogue that actually happened in September 1976. KGB general interrogating Karel. Anyways, the result of that is that the KGB guy tells the STB, we need to get rid of this guy. This guy is not trustworthy. He's gone native. I think he's working for the Americans. His loyalties have shifted. They hadn't, but this is what he tells them. And there's some explanation for why he does that, but that's maybe not the answer to the question now. Karel goes back to the States, so 76, late 1976. And he's basically ordered to stop working for the CIA, or the communists are going to murder him, execute him. So he does stop working for the CIA in 1977, beginning in 1977. So he is essentially from 1977 to 1981, he's not working in intelligence at all. He's just living in the United States. He's been cut off from the communists, and because of that, was forced to quit the CIA or be killed, for fear of being murdered. And he just is he's struggling. He's sort of like teaching classes at universities, not making that much money. His wife is making money because she's in the diamond game, but he's pretty, discouraged and depressed on himself. When Reagan gets elected, the communists, Moscow and in Prague, Czechoslovakia, and are frightened because Reagan sort of has this rhetoric about, he's much more aggressive in sort of, how he talks about confronting the Soviet Union and nuclear war and things like that. And the Eastern Bloc, the Russians and the Czechs, are super paranoid, and they're like, oh shit, this guy's a madman, meaning Reagan. He's going to launch a nuclear war. We need to find out what the hell is going on. So they launched this thing called Operation Ryan, which is like a full court press of sort of like reactivate all possible assets because we need to find out what the hell is going on. So Karel is reactivated. So two things have also happened in the meantime. The KGB general who discredited him initially has sort of fallen out of favor. So they say, we don't actually trust that guy's opinion anymore. And we're desperate, all hands on deck situation. We're desperate to get as much intelligence as we can. So Karel is reactivated. The truth is, it seems likely that the guy that reactivated Karel was also collaborating with the CIA. So that he was it's like an entrapment type thing. He was reactivated. They then arrest him for being reactivated, kind of thing. So there's a lot of pieces. I mean, this is sort of I just went through 15 years of his life, and there's a lot of sort of ups and downs and some details that sort of would flesh out that story and make it make more sense. but he's sort of out of practice for a while, depressed. They come to him to try and revive him. He can say no, but also because he's sort of marginalized and down on his luck or whatever, he's also like, excited to be needed again. It's more exciting than what he's been doing when he's sort of been teaching, at community colleges or whatever he's been doing. And so he takes it, and which is sort of like the classic, it's like that's like a real movie, like I think there's all, how many movie, westerns or whatever, where it's like the gunfighter has to come back for what, he's retired, but he's got to come back for
Just one more job. Just one more job.
Yeah,
I'm too
exactly.
old for this shit.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what it is. And of course, that's that's ego and all that kind of stuff. And that's the right. I mean, this is this sort of the psychological, like, you need a guy that has irrational confidence that's willing to take this crazy risk to go over there, but also the guy's irrational confidence is his ultimate undoing. You know what I mean? That's what gets him caught, because anyone with sort of any sense of perspective would be like, listen, I'm lucky to have made it this far. And if he would have said no, it's entirely plausible that he just would have gone on living as a civilian in the United States, certainly to the collapse of communism. So for 6 or 7 more years until 89. So yeah, so that's what sort of the ultimate sort of, go ahead.
If you look into Cuba, there's a relationship called organized crime, which was the mob working with the CIA to try and assassinate Castro. And what I kind of started to notice was a lot of people would use the description that nobody knew when the mob began or the CIA ended, like because they became basically the same head to the same coin. And you're like, well, the tactics are similar. Well, yeah, the tactics are similar in the fact that they would prey on top of a lot of people that they would bring in. The mafia would do this as well too. It's common in mob movies, but like, what else you got better to do, huh? I mean, it's a Tuesday. Just do this job with me. It's just one job. Well, the agencies did that as well too. They developed tricks off both of each other. And which is interesting. If you look into Hollywood history and you check out the blacklist, oh my God, the worst thing in the world was to be put on one of those blacklists. And if you look at those actors that were blacklisted, what they would do to try and get back off the blacklist or try not to be on that blacklist, they would go to the ends of the earth, including doing things that would be seen as spying on communism and tactics that the FBI were more than happy to, procure from another person. It was like, they tackled everyone's emotional, their mental states, and really preyed upon that. Like, you look, I mean, you want to get back into Hollywood, you got to do this. And then it was like, what? Like, there were people that like the FBI eventually created their image on screen. Much as we talk about the agent's credibility in front of the eyes of the public, the way that they look to the American public being red, white, and blue in this establishment. Well, they even created this thing about the censorship code office, but there was this idea out there that Hoover created, which was the bad guys can shoot as many times as they want, but they have to miss. Whenever our FBI is on screen, they have to be portrayed as badasses. And that's what we see even today sometimes. I think recently has been more about corrupted cops, but they're still attached to authority. A good example is Batman. Who's Batman attached to? Commissioner Gordon. He needs to have these vigilantes can be vigilantes, but they have to be attached to some level of authority. And that's all from way back in Hoover's invasion into FBI. But I mean, there was eventually got to a point where Hoover was looking for like communists and also homosexuals and so many and trying to root them out in Hollywood. Well, they found a good list of blacklisted actors where they go, hey, we'll get you back into Hollywood, but your only job is going to be to portray us in movies. And that means you can't drink, you can't have any affairs, you have to be married, you have to have a great straight life, be religious, all these things that represent good qualities. And they would keep these people on the back lot and would just implement them in movies because they knew who these people were. They had the profile built up, they had their men, they didn't need to look anywhere else. And I'm just like, you would think like you're coming off the bus as a fresh like kid ready for Hollywood. Nope, because you're screwed from the beginning because the whole industry's bought. And you're just like, to me, it just makes the intelligence agencies. I mean, I find it so damn fascinating when you start realizing like some of the extent that they went into to be able to get profiles on people and be able to kind of work out like the long game, even though it necessarily wouldn't have even worked out the way they initially thought, because you can see through documentation how they eventually had to like think on the spot, like, oh shit, like this just happened. How are we going to recover from this? Well, that's good. We can use that to our advantage, put it at this way. And then they spun it a different angle. And you're like, I bravo to whoever did that and thought that they were doing the right thing. But still at the same time, from like when you're looking back from a historic standpoint, it's like, dude, you can make every single one of these intelligence agents, you can make Carl's story into a fucking movie, because it's just like it's all like really like James Bond Hollywood. It might not be sipping martinis and doing all the girl stuff, but if you look strictly from a historical intelligence community and like the power that they have standpoint, I mean, bravo.
Yeah. No, I think that's, that was people, I think you said at the beginning too, when maybe we were talking off cameras, like, you don't, why don't you, like you had never heard this story before. And so, one of the things that when you're trying to convince someone to publish a book, you got to tell them why they should care about this story. Why not? Why is this story different than other stories? And so, what, my sales pitch when I was trying to get this published was one that I had all this, some of the stuff I've already said. I can get into the real psychology. I have these records, and I have, I've spoken to the guy and whatever, so I can really get into the sort of this what psychologically makes a guy like this tick. Hopefully, right? That's my goal. The other thing though is that you simultaneously you're getting this detail of how things function on a day-to-day basis, and so that's exactly what you're talking about. You're like like you could tell the story of an individual if you can connect the dots A to Z of how this is unfolded. It's not just that's probably how the intelligence agencies operate. It's like, no, this in this case, at least in this case, this is what happened, right? And in Carl's case, it's like, why is this story not talked about more? Well, it's not talked about more for a couple of reasons. One, he didn't, in the end, there's some important things he was involved in. There's there's a chapter in the book, at least one person is killed, and he's sort of implicated in that. That's a Soviet agent that he's sort of affiliated with his death. So there's like real consequences for the things he's doing, but he didn't like win the Cold War, lose the Cold War, prevent a nuclear holocaust single-handedly, right?
Why does
So
that
in the
matter,
end,
though? Why does that
that's
matter
right,
to
it
the
doesn't. That's
public?
what I'm
It's like
saying.
every
Right.
Cold War movie or Vietnam War movie has to be either the main climax of the situation that happened. But I don't know. I guess I'm a fan of the Cold War, but I start looking into like everything about it. This to me is fascinating as hell. It should be made into a movie. There's plenty of other stuff out there that don't need to be some giant, oh, they're the ones that saved the war. It doesn't need to be that. Just it gets us better insight on a whole chunk of history that is practically secret as hell. Like there's still documentation we don't have on a lot of this stuff.
Yep. So I think you're right. That's what I mean. For me, my argument was like, this is a story that you can tell start to finish about a human being, a real person that was actually doing these things, right? And I totally agree with you. In fact, to me, the most interesting movies, like in a historical context, are not usually like the biopic about what was happening. It's like a story that is set in this historical time, and I understand more about that history than like the Will Smith Muhammad Ali movie. Do I understand the 60s from watching that? Not really. It's like a giant Hollywood movie about a famous person, and I know the story already. It's an old movie, but it just comes to mind. It's like, I've heard the story about Muhammad Ali 1,000 times. Great guy, interesting character, but do we need to hear the story again? Other thing that I think has kind of held this story back from being told more is there's no heroes, there's no and there's no clear conclusion, right, about good guys and bad guys. And actually, a lot of it is not is it's not fully embarrassing for the CIA, but it doesn't paint the whole. Nobody's a hero. There are no heroes, and there's no full bad guys either. And that's a little bit complicated when you try and tell people that, like, actually it wasn't good guys against bad guys, and it wasn't, and the CIA is not perfect, and the CIA is actually, they obviously made a mistake by letting this guy into the, whatever the method was, they let a double agent work for them. That's a mistake, right? And so, when things are, people want, movies in particular, obviously they want this simple narrative, and this is not a simple narrative. And so you want, and so there's nobody like represses this story in sort of an organized way. But even when I'm, just straight up, when I'm going to publishers and I'm saying, this is an interesting story, and you need to give your 3-sentence pitch of what the story's about. They're like, yeah, there's a lot of spy stories out there. And it's like, yeah, but this one, for these reasons, is got this, these things that other ones don't. Like, I read a lot of books. I don't hear this story. I don't read this story. I don't see this movie. So I think, I'm totally on your side here in terms of like, there's sort of the cartoon version of history, and then there's like the things that happened, and the things that happened are not always black and white and clear and easy, and not every story that took place during the Cold War is just explains the whole meaning of the Cold War in one story or whatever. And so like it's a story about a guy who was involved in some serious shit. And by tracking this guy through that serious shit, you get some I hope you get some new insights, and it makes you think about things in a different way. And when I was trying to put it together, I'm like, I'm I'm putting together first a book that I would want to read, but two, like a book that I don't see out there. You know what I mean? Like most of the books I read are not kind of kind of pulling at these same strings. There are some, I'm not like a totally unique person. There's other people kind of stuff, that was, so I think we're on this, I guess in the end, I think I'm on the same page as you. I'm more interested in these sort of nuanced, detailed stories that raise as many questions as they do present answers, if you know what I mean.
I think it just needs to spark up the public's interest in it. There's a large amount of people that are obviously very anti a lot of things that the government does, but I think it gets stuck into a category of like specific race stories or things of that sort. I'm like, look, there's what this story highlights to me is the expendable nature that intelligence communities just use people at their own kind of free whim in a sense without caring the ramifications on a person's life. I mean, if you heard Vern's story, the guy I've been mentioning a lot about his thing with like Castro and all that, I mean, it's fucking heartbreaking because it's a guy that literally a whole chunk of his life is gone. His wife is gone. He won't talk about that. There's a bunch of things that, I think when the public hears that, there's a lot of people that get a real deep invested response because now you're looking at a more human emotional aspect and what would happen if they put themselves in that scenario, which I think those tides will turn. I mean, it's everything in our God knows we don't need another Fast and Furious movie, but I think like the tides will turn in the sense of like there's a good documentary that went out and nobody even really heard of it before, and it was called Wormwood. And what Wormwood
Yeah,
was
I've seen
about,
that. That is excellent.
yeah, and that's not like there's no like doesn't leave you feeling good or bad. It's just like holy crap, this is a horrible thing that happened to Frank Olson. But I that you ask anybody about that documentary, most people haven't seen it or haven't even heard of it, and Netflix does not recommend it to you at all. So it's just like you have to go and type that in and first of all know what the name is. And it's got a star-studded cast in it. So it's like, what is this? It's like I've seen this guy in the Ballad of Buster Scruggs, but to get to what we were talking about a little bit off air about the prison time. And the obviously you can tell me the fact-based thing, and then we can get into the little bit of what the suspected intelligence connection thing there.
Yeah. Yeah, so Karl is, he's eventually arrested, and there's some difficulty. So the prosecutor that is prosecuting him is Rudolph Giuliani of recent fame of the last Trump campaign. But when he's caught, the interrogation is sort of botched. There's two sort of government agencies interrogating him: the CIA and the FBI. The CIA is interested in finding out what kind of secrets he saw. They want to know what kind of intelligence has been leaked to the Soviets or to to Czechoslovakia. The FBI wants to prosecute, find evidence of a crime and turn it over to Giuliani so he can prosecute this guy for committing crimes. In this instance, the CIA basically makes a promise to him and says, "Tell us what you did, and we'll let you go, and we'll just deport you, send you home." And so he kind of tells them a bunch of stuff that he did. The FBI basically then takes that and turns that evidence over to Giuliani, and they try to use that to prosecute him. There's a kind of long running court battle because he's been promised that he, if he confesses to these things that he's going to be immune. They try to put the squeeze on his wife Hana, so they put her in jail. They try to get her to testify. She refuses. They try and hold her of contempt of court for not testifying. They put her in jail. So that's sort of all happening. And in the meantime, he is in jail. He's in MCC, so that's the Metropolitan Correctional Center, I believe it stands. It's in downtown Manhattan. It's where Jeffrey Epstein hung himself. That prison. So he's in there with a whole bunch of really serious characters. John Gotti, famous mafia boss of the 1980s, is in there for a while, overlapping him. He's in there with this guy, Sandy Alexander, who was a head of the Hell's Angel, New York chapter of the Hell's Angels, and he was in there for, I think he murdered a cop. I think he was in there for murdering a cop, and Karl and him become friends. So while in prison, sort of in limbo, legal limbo, somebody tries to murder Karl. And Sandy Alexander, his friend, this Hell's Angel, actually kind of fends him off and protects him. And then the next day, the guy who had tried to stab Karl was no longer in jail there. So Karl certainly speculates that somebody, not more than speculates, believes that somebody in the Justice Department, FBI, CIA, planted that guy in there in an attempt to murder him to sort of solve this problem that they weren't going to be able to prosecute him, and that was a big embarrassment. I'm not sure. I want to believe. I don't want to believe that story. I want to believe it's a random encounter, but
Well, it's not
there's a lot.
normal conditions to move somebody from a prison. Usually it's just
There's a
solitary
lot.
confinement.
There's a lot. Exactly. There's kind of a lot of stuff circulating here. He was in a high security wing of the prison. How this guy got basically a blade in there. Who knows? So Karl. I think I would say this. Karl's take on it, though, is that there was some sort of conspiracy to murder him, but it was basically he doesn't think it was like the president was ordering somebody to murder. You know what I mean? It's not that high level, but he thinks maybe guards were complicit. Somebody got the guards to let this guy have a blade. This kind of stuff. So it's hard to I don't have it's hard for me to identify the culprit that would. I mean, if you were the district attorney, Rudolph Giuliani was the Justice Department head, prosecutor for the Southern District of New York, prosecuting Wall Street, prosecuting the mafia or whatever, and obviously at that time had pretty serious political ambitions. Obviously went on to be the mayor of New York City, and 15 years later or so, 12 years later or something like that. So the idea that he would be ordering assassinations is pretty implausible to me. I mean, I think but I don't know what to say. I think there's also the pieces don't fit. You know what I mean? The pieces don't fit that he would be targeted and why he would be targeted and what happened to this guy afterwards. I was never able to really get any sort of transfer records or anything like that. I poked around a bit, but it's messy. And then there's a video. Sandy Alexander, the Hell's Angel, who's dead now. Karl does have a video of Sandy Alexander that I saw years ago, basically a VHS tape. Sandy Alexander was, filming himself. He was sick. I don't remember. He had pancreatic cancer or something like that. So he filmed himself sort of telling his own autobiography. And one of the stories he told was this story. And so there are at least two sources. Karl tells the story, and then Sandy Alexander tells the story. So there's, it's hard for me to reason why Sandy Alexander would have, there's no money involved or whatever.
He's dying, so he's not going to be able to get any profit off of it.
There's something strange there, and certainly it was a huge embarrassment. They didn't, ultimately Karl is traded because it's a fact. They just can't do anything with him. They're trying to squeeze Hana. She's found contempt of court. They appeal that, and that case actually goes to the Supreme Court. And I spoke to her lawyer, who is now a professor at Columbia, who defended her. He worked for the ACLU, and so he defended her at the Supreme Court. And there was never a ruling on that case because they argued the case. The Supreme Court was in deliberation, and they traded him. So I'm not sure. That's also another thing you can feed into the sort of the question marks is that the Supreme Court was maybe going to rule that she didn't have to testify against him. That was their last piece of credible evidence they were going to be able to use. And They were just going to have to cut him loose. And he was in jail for more than a year, which is, you know, they were both American citizens. So you're talking about, you know, right to a speedy trial, all those sort of things, being held in MCC, a violent prison, for a year with no trial. Is so there. It was a mess. You know, it was a real mess, and they didn't have a way out of it. And ultimately, you know, they solved the problem by just getting rid of them, trading them.
The only thing I can think of is that I would believe that it would be the intelligence agency or someone trying to cover up maybe the secret intelligence knowledges that he knows. I mean, even with Vern's case, the guy I've been mentioning, I told him like the only reason he's probably able to talk about all the Castro and Cuba stuff is because that's so publicly known. I mean, nothing's worse than 694 assassination attempts on the guy. And not a single one of them failed. Like that's just well documented through our history. Operation Northwoods is another good example. Some of the intelligence stuff, like even if it's small scale, but just like tactics that they have, whether it's propaganda or just covert abilities of, you know, implementing or trying to do regime change, or I don't know, sparking up like a little bit of rise and just some resistance fighters. I mean, those little small things, you don't know what gets labeled as like a security risk. And like I said, they don't think of like the agencies don't think of you as like, we got to protect these people. It's more like, is this person going to hurt or help us? And it's like, that's kind of when you examine it from that aspect. I mean, it makes a lot of sense, but I wouldn't be able to say for sure unless you came across a document that states like, take this fucking guy out. He's going to spoil everything.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
I would just
obviously.
add, let me add something there. So as I said at the beginning, right, you know, I went through all these files, these declassified STB files, and because there were so many, and I kind of was, you know, I had a job. I mean, especially when, you know, eventually I got a contract to write this book, so I was able to sort of at the end sort of just focus on that for a few months and just, you know, finish the job. But for a long time, you know, I first wrote a long newspaper article for The Guardian about 5 or 6 years ago. It was sort of the seed of this book. And so in between there, when I was trying to pitch the book and get an agent, all these sort of things, I was going through these documents, you know. And so there's this archive center in Prague that you have to go to get the documents. And some of the documents are digitized, so you can go through them that way. Some you have to go there and physically sit in an old school library and flip through them. Over the course of the time that I started and finished researching this, some parts of files, and some files were reclassified by the Czech Republic at the request of the U.S. Embassy. So, in other words, I don't know. It's hard for me. I never anticipated that happening during this time because they have blanketly unclassified so many documents. And at some point now, whatever, 30 years after the collapse of the communist regime, when these things have been made public, somebody in the U.S. State Department or the CIA or whatever had gone to have certain documents have things redacted from them. So there are definitely things in those documents at some point that people. I don't want to say that they're like total. None of the things are like take this guy out, right, or whatever. But it's like stuff that probably could lead to stuff that could lead to stuff that could lead to stuff or something, you know. So this is an interesting point of what you're saying is that, you know, you have this even today. So what I'm saying is, like, I don't know what year is it now, 2023. So in 2015, there were some documents that the United States government decided that was an old Czechoslovak STB file from the 70s or the 80s that the United States government successfully lobbied the Czech government to reclassify. And why they would do that unless it had gave away something that they viewed as important.
Well, with a lot of these declassification teams, it's a whole group of people that are doing these when they're declassifying documents. So sometimes, I mean, you're going at that person's discretion as well too. They have basic guidelines and principles to declassify a document. But I mean, if they saw something and go, wait, shit, we should have not classified that or declassified that, reclassify it. I mean, that's not super insane. It happens a lot with the Kennedy assassination, but luckily when people started to do now, there's like documents that were released in the recent release in December that were stuff from like 2017, where people are like, look at this letter. It talks about how they're talking about Oswald, but he stole a Bible from a hotel. I go, that was released in 2017, but it was all in Spanish. And I just use Google Translate to be able to morph it together. But there's a lot of like really incriminating stuff. And then people are complaining like these are all past releases that they reclassified. But what happened is the community started taking screenshots of it and just saving it. And there are some where like they scanned them and it's like upside down and they scanned it like 80,000 times to where you can't read a single thing on it. And it's like, dude, you could just sit there and carefully scan it like you do all the other ones, but then there's just one page that's just completely unreadable. But then they made it more clear in the new release. So it's like what they see as a security risk or something like that. I mean, we're at war with Russia 1 minute and then we're not, and then we could be at war again. So to stop implication, you got to reclassify those just so it doesn't seem like they're going to get pissed off if they come across. So, the intelligence community, trying to understand them, I mean, that would take a whole panel of psychologists, and I don't even think anybody would get that right.
For sure. Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, that's true. I guess the only point I was making is that, so, I mean, the examples you're giving is about the US government reclassifying US government documents. The example I'm giving is about the Czech government reclassifying portions of Czech documents on behalf of the US government, right? So there's like somebody in the United States reviewed those documents, went to the State Department, went to the US Embassy in Prague, went to the Czech government, asked them to reclassify it, and did. So that, I mean, I guess you're right. It's not that uncommon, but it's also somebody was in 2015. Somebody was reviewing those documents in the United States and went through a lot of effort to eliminate some piece of information.
What the hell did they trade to get that to go on?
I know. It's interesting. It's just and you're right though. I mean, we could speculate a million times, and it just could be somebody just, as you say, somebody just stumbled across and was like, oh, we should cross that off. Okay, no problem. Like it's hard. We can speculate and talk about it forever. It's interesting.
That one's a little bit more complex because you have to go talk to the other country to be able to get that reclassified.
Yep. Yep.
So I'm just thinking, like, who the hell just paid a price? Somebody just did something and is in somebody's debt at this point, because you never want to be in debt with those types of situations. But we've almost been talking 2 hours, Ben. Is there a place where people can find your links, man? I want people to be able to find your book. I appreciate the time you gave me to talk on my show. If you have a Twitter handle as well, too, please promote that as well.
Yeah, so I mean, I have a website. So my name is Benjamin or Ben Cunningham. So my website is just bcunningham.org. I'm kind of revamping it now, but you can get my bio there, links to the book and stuff like that. The book's available anywhere you buy a book. I mean, obviously Amazon or whatever, but Barnes and Noble, bookstores, local bookstores. I'm always like a guy that's trying to support local bookstores. If they don't have it, they're going to be able to get it for you. It's the publisher's Public Affairs, and their parent company is Hachette. They're one of the leading global big five publishing companies. So you shouldn't have a hard time tracking it down. And just maybe the title is "The Liar: How a Double Agent in the CIA Became the Cold War's Last Honest Man." And I think it's a story. I tried to really make it. It's nonfiction. It's true. I put in a hell of a lot of work, but I also tried to make it read like a novel, like a story that you can read and you can enjoy. I don't think it's too heavy a read. So I hope that was my goal, at least, to make it, kind of a nonfiction spy story, spy novel. I have a Twitter, which I sort of dip in and out of. It's @Cunning_tweets, @Cunning_tweets. I'm on LinkedIn if people want to connect with me there, and really enjoyed talking and appreciate you having me, Robbie, and look forward to hopefully being in touch in the future. And I'm going to definitely check out some more of your episodes, and really cool to be here.
Well, I appreciate the time you gave me, and I'm going to link all your links in the description. It's been a pleasure chatting, and thanks for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank Podcast.